Good evening. I'm Elizabeth Horner. I'm the Director of Education at Emory's Michael C. Carlos Museum, and I thank you all for joining us tonight for this talk. This talk is a part of a series of lectures on the avatars of Vishnu that is held in conjunction with a class at Emory University being taught by Professor Ellen Goff of the Religion Department. And these talks are made possible by the generous financial support of the Christian Human Foundation and the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation. So we are grateful to them, as well as to Piyush and Harshna Patel and Jay Patel, who are helping us to grow our collection of Indian miniature painting. And so first, before I turn over the podium to Ellen, I just want to say that the Carlos Museum is open again. Finally, we are open to the public. And so we encourage you to come. You have to go online to carlos.emory.edu and make a reservation because we have limited the capacity to ensure your safety. But we do hope you will come and see our current exhibition, Wondrous Worlds, Art in Islam Through Time and Place, as well as all of our permanent collections, including the Asian collection. So it's my great pleasure to turn our virtual podium over to Professor Ellen Goff, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Thanks, Ellen.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. It's my pleasure tonight to virtually welcome to the Carlos, Dr. Joan Cummins. She's the Lisa and Bernard Selz Senior Curator of Asian Art at the Brooklyn Museum. She received her PhD from Columbia University and has since worked as a curator of Asian art for the Boston Museum of Fine Art and then, of course, the Brooklyn Museum. She's curated a number of exhibitions, and her first book, Indian Paintings from Cave Temples to the Colonial Period, which is from 2006, draws extensively on the Boston Museum of Fine Arts collection of Indian paintings. And I would say it's just a great introduction to Indian painting in general, if you want to check that out. Perhaps more importantly for this talk, however, in 2011 at the Brooklyn Museum, she brought together more than 170 sculptures, paintings, textiles, and other objects for an exhibition entitled Vishnu, Hinduism's blue-skinned savior. And we're really thankful that Dr. Cummins is here with us tonight, and then she will come to our class on Thursday to discuss with us, with the students in this class who are curating this exhibit at the Carlos of objects of Vishnu, because we've really used the catalog from that exhibit extensively in the class to help figure out our pieces, but there's still a ton of questions left. So we're really thankful she's here. I should also say that there's a series of blogs Dr. Cummins has written on pieces of art at the Brooklyn Museum, at the Brooklyn Museum's webpage, which are really enjoyable. You should check them out. And in one of them, she says her favorite avatar of Vishnu is the boar. So I'm happy that she's talking about her favorite avatar today and the other animal avatars of Vishnu. So please join me in welcoming to the Carlos, Dr. Joan Cummins, who will present her lecture entitled Many Shades of Blue, the Animal Avatars of Vishnu.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ellen, and thank you, Elizabeth, for that very kind introduction. And thanks for inviting me to speak tonight. As Ellen mentioned, I curated an exhibition about Vishnu in 2011. And I frankly haven't thought a lot about the avatars since then, but it's been a real pleasure to revisit the subject. And it is particularly fun for me to focus my attentions on the first 4 avatars of Vishnu, the animal or part animal forms, because these often get short shrift in the rush to get to the more lengthy biographies of the anthropomorphic avatars, Rama and Krishna, if one is treating Krishna as an avatar. I'm opening my talk with the tags that we used in the Brooklyn iteration of the Vishnu show. I should mention that it was actually the Frist Center in Nashville that originated the show, which I started working on before I got to Brooklyn. But these tags that we had made for the Brooklyn show were designed by the San Francisco-based illustrator Sanjay Patel. These playful interpretations of the 4 avatars we'll be examining today were adapted from his book, The Little Book of Hindu Deities, which is completely charming and worth checking out. He also has a few short animated films that are also worth tracking down. So let's get into it. Starting very briefly with the basics. Today we will be looking at forms taken by the Hindu god Vishnu. Hinduism has 3 major male deities who form a sort of trinity. They're shown here in this rock-cut relief from Ellora in Maharashtra in Western India. When treated as parts of a trinity, Brahma is described as the creator. He is shown at the left with his multiple faces. Then we have Vishnu, the topic of today's talk. He is the preserver and he is shown at the center. And then there is Shiva, who is the destroyer, who is shown here at the right. Now, compared to the creator and the destroyer, Vishnu, the preserver, doesn't sound terribly interesting, but it is in fact Vishnu's job to save the world from chaos and annihilation. And he does this over and over again. And in fact, Brahma, the creator, is not widely worshipped in India, except usually as part of this triad of gods. Vishnu and Shiva each attract millions of worshippers, and the worshippers of Vishnu, called Vaishnavas, consider him to be the supreme power. Now, the most important gods in Hinduism are said to be both formless and the embodiment of all imaginable forms. There is a famous incident in the Bhagavad Gita, a devotional text dedicated to Krishna, when a character named Arjuna asks the god Krishna, who has been living among men on earth, to manifest his true divine form. Krishna does so, and Arjuna sees all the gods and minor deities, all people, all animals, the whole cosmos wrapped up in one giant, blindingly brilliant, immeasurable body. That vision that Krishna grants to Arjuna is what the artists attempted to capture in these 2 images. The one on the left is a painting from the Carlos collection, and the sculpture on the right is from a temple in Kathmandu, Nepal. The vision is too much for Arjuna to bear, and he begs Krishna to resume his more limited, more approachable form. So when we see a sculpted or painted image of a god, we should understand it as capturing only a small portion of his or her extent, power, or reach. What we're seeing is a representation of a form that the god assumed when revealing himself to a very lucky devotee, probably thousands of years ago. The devotee had this vision of God, then told everyone what it looked like, and then that became the standard for representing the god. So this standard for Vishnu has the god standing straight up and down, usually with 4 arms, wearing the crown and jewelry of a prince. This, in his 4 hands, he usually holds a discus, a club or mace. Here's the discus, here's the club, a conch shell, and then often there is a lotus, although the lotus is sort of more optional. All of these items that he holds in his hand are emblematic. First of all, the straight posture represents his role in maintaining balance in the cosmos. The spinning disc and the spiraling conch shell represent the cyclical nature of time, and the lotus represents transcendence. The mace is really just a weapon. The other physical aspect of Vishnu revealed in Revelations, but not usually captured in sculpture, is that he is blue. There's not an origin story for the blue color. There are surprisingly few texts that question or attempt to explain his blueness. He simply is blue. But as you will see, Vishnu has strong associations with the sky and the ocean, so the color suits him. Vishnu, like many gods, is understood to reside in the heavens, high above us. Often when he comes to earth, he does so riding on an eagle named Garuda. Garuda is usually represented as part man, part eagle, and he's a fierce warrior. There are quite a few images of Vishnu riding on Garuda, and we can imagine that this is what we would see if the god were swooping down from above to save us. What I'm showing you here is a relatively early large terracotta relief that came off of a brick temple, dates to about the 5th century. And then next to it, a much smaller gilt bronze sculpture from Cambodia. And you can see very different ways of treating this idea of Vishnu riding on Garuda. But in both cases, we can imagine that this is what someone would see when the god was coming down from the heavens to preserve us. But swooping down on his eagle isn't the only way that Vishnu has descended to save his followers. In fact, his preferred way has been to assume new earthly forms called avatars. The avatars come to interact with men and demons and beasts, and their primary purpose is usually to restore balance when the world has become chaotic. There are 10 of them in most counts, although there are some lists with 28, and there are some early lists where there are fewer than that. When Vishnu takes form as an avatar, the avatar is usually a much smaller, less powerful, often mortal form of the god. The avatars are typically far more powerful than the humans and demons they encounter on Earth, but they represent only a tiny fraction of the god's being and ability. I like to compare avatars to the god reaching one hand or even one finger into the earthly domain to straighten things out. And that hand or finger assumes a new form each time that is appropriate to the task at hand. So the avatars are, the standard group of 10 is Matsya the fish, we'll talk about today, Korma the turtle, we're working sort of clockwise from the bottom here, Varaha the boar, Nara Simha, who is half man, half lion, or half man, half tiger, Vamana the dwarf, Parashurama, the Brahmin with an axe, Rama, the great king. Oops, my cursor has disappeared. Oh no, there it is back. Rama, the great king, Balarama, the brother of Krishna, who steps in when Krishna sort of graduates beyond avatar status for some believers. The Buddha, which is there's a whole long story about the Buddha being an avatar and what that means, which unfortunately I'm not going to get into today. And then a future avatar, one that has not yet arrived. It's Kalki, who rides on a horse. Now, the animal avatars are chronologically the earliest of Vishnu's avatar appearances on Earth, arriving when the Earth was really quite new. So to understand the setting and circumstances, we should look at the primary Vaishnava creation account. In the beginning, there was a primordial ocean. This ocean will play a major role in the first 3 avatar accounts. But at the start, there was just Vishnu, dozing on a giant multi-headed serpent named Shesha or Ananta. He's afloat on the waters, and artistic depictions sometimes show him with his goddess companion, Sri Devi or Lakshmi, and sometimes with a cast of dozens, as in the sculpture from the Carlos Museum. But in scriptural accounts, they usually describe him as being alone. As Vishnu sleeps, a lotus grows from his navel, and it blooms to reveal the god Brahma inside, Brahma the creator. Brahma is visible, this small figure right here on the sculpture, and then here coming out of the lotus in the painting. Brahma the creator then speaks the world into existence. So Brahma is the creator, but Vishnu is the source of the creator. In most Hindu accounts, the nascent earth is still mostly all ocean, with very little dry land, populated by a very small number of Manus, who are the ancestors of modern men. This begins to explain why the first avatars are in animal form rather than human. And it certainly explains why the first avatar is a fish. Now, before we dive into the story of Matsya the fish, I want to say something brief about the many beautiful paintings that we're going to see today. Indian paintings on paper, often misleadingly called miniature paintings, typically come from manuscripts and were meant to be viewed in succession as illustrations of narratives. Some of our best illustrations of avatars come from manuscript paintings, particularly those made in the Punjab Hills. This is an area southwest of the Himalayas, roughly corresponding to the modern state of Himachal Pradesh. These paintings mostly date to the 18th and early 19th century, when many kings of very small city-states that were in sort of every valley in this area, they were all avid devotees of Vishnu and Krishna. The avatar paintings tend to come from three different contexts. Some were made as illustrations for the multi-volume sacred text dedicated to Vishnu called the Bhagavata Purana. Others were made for texts that were solely dedicated to the avatars, simply called Dashavatara or 10 avatars. And typically there are 10 paintings and one of each avatar. A third source for these paintings was the wildly popular devotional poem, the Gita Govinda, which is dedicated to worship of Krishna, but begins with very short verses celebrating the 10 avatars. In these paintings, we get the most detailed and narrative depictions of the avatars, whereas in sculptures, we tend to get them presented as icons, just standing still, maybe caught in a telling posture, but really not in action. Vishnu descends in the form of the fish Matsya, his first avatar, because a demon named Hayagriva has stolen Hinduism's most sacred and ancient texts, the 4 Vedas. The Vedas were spoken by Brahma, and Brahma is initially in charge of caring for them. Hayagriva, the demon, steals the Vedas from a sleeping Brahma, presumably because the Vedas are inherently powerful, but also because knowledge of these texts is empowering. This quest for more power is a trait that we'll see over and over again from the demons. So Hayagriva takes the Vedas from sleeping Brahma, and he takes them down to his lair at the bottom of the ocean. Brahma asks Vishnu to help and to retrieve them, and is entirely appropriate that Vishnu assumes the form of a great fish to swim down to retrieve the sacred texts. When Hayagriva knows that Vishnu is coming, he hides in a giant conch shell. Vishnu finds him, beats him in battle, retrieves the Vedas, and returns them to Brahma. So in this painting here, we see the great fish with Vishnu actually emerging from its mouth. Vishnu is holding the 4 manuscripts, the 4 Vedas, in his 4 hands, and the beheaded Hayagriva is sort of hanging out of his shell where he had been hiding. You might notice nice details in this painting, like the fact that in order to free up his hands to hold the 4 Vedas, Vishnu has tucked his lotus into his belt and wears his discus. Oh, he also tucked his conch shell into his belt. So here's the lotus tucked into his belt and the conch shell next to it. And he's wearing his discus sort of like a bangle on his arm, freeing up his hands to hold on to the Vedas. Here are two more painted depictions. One of them is another manuscript painting, and then this round piece is actually, we think it was a pot lid painted in Orissa. It's on wood. So on the left, the Vedas are now depicted as little figures, and Vishnu is cutting them out of Hayagriva's stomach. I don't know how well you can make that out, but there are the little Vedas, and Hayagriva's not doing so well. On the right, we don't see the Vedas, but Vishnu grabs the fleeing Hayagriva by the hair. Now, demons like Hayagriva are an interesting class of beings in Hinduism. They go by a number of different names in Sanskrit: Asura, Rakshasa, and the Persian-derived term Dev also comes into play. And it's not always clear if these terms refer to the same classes of creature or to different levels of demons. Demons are not inherently evil, but they're more like very flawed, very powerful people. All of the temptations and missteps that humans make, demons are likely to experience even more. And because they're imbued with great strength and the ability to fly and other skills, their poor judgments become that much more dangerous. You can see that there wasn't a strict iconography for how demons were portrayed. They could be green or purple, young or old, horned or fanged or not. And frankly, it's in the depiction of demons that artists got to take some liberties and have a little fun. Now, there is a second Matsya story beyond the saving of the four Vedas. And this is sometimes recounted instead of the Hayagriva story and is sometimes conflated with it. In this account, King Manu is one of the earth's first inhabitants. He's a righteous ruler, and one day he's praying by the water when a tiny fish comes out of the water and asks him for protection. Manu takes the fish home and puts it in a bowl. And the next morning, the fish is too big for the bowl. So Manu moves it to larger and larger tanks until it actually outgrows the big temple tank in town and has to be placed in the river and then in the ocean. Even after it's been released into the ocean, the fish continues to grow. Eventually, the fish reveals his divine nature to Manu and instructs Manu to build a boat and put one of each species, or maybe two, in the boat, along with the 7 sages who protect the Vedas. They tether the boat to the giant fish. And in this painting, you can see that they're using a snake to tether the boat to the fish. They tether the boat to the giant fish, and just as they've tethered it, a giant deluge sweeps over the earth, destroying everything except the boat's occupants, who are then left to repopulate the earth. The story might sound familiar to some of you. The painting that I'm showing you here combines the two stories. So we've got the giant fish and the boat tethered to it. But we've also got sleeping Brahma up at the top, and we've got Hayagriva lying wounded at the bottom of the ocean. And the name of the 4 Vedas are written on the fish's neck, sort of. This painting is interesting in part because it shows Matsya as purely fish, which is quite unusual. Far more often you get Vishnu sort of emerging from the fish. Now, Matsya is not widely worshipped by himself as an avatar. There are Matsya-related rites that one might perform for specific purposes, but there are very, very few temples or even subsidiary shrines in larger temples that are dedicated to the fish avatar. What I'm showing you here is a relatively new shrine in Chennai, formerly known as Madras. It's a very unorthodox form for a temple, entirely outside with this sort of circle of pillars around a central image. Its dedicatory texts refer to the deluge story, and it appears to have been built in part in hopes of deterring future floods and other disasters like the 2004 tsunami that hit this area of southeastern India very hard. Here and elsewhere, you can see that the tendency is to depict Matsya as both a fish and as the anthropomorphic manifestation of Vishnu. He's usually shown emerging from the mouth of the fish, but sometimes he's shown having a fish tail, kind of like a merman. This desire to put a familiar face and a relatably human face on the avatar relates closely to the Hindu notion of darshan, or the desire to make visual contact, eye-to-eye contact with a god during worship. Also important in some branches of Vishnu worship is bhakti, which is devotion, in which a devotee develops a personal and emotional relationship with the divine. And that's something that is much facilitated by the god having a human face. Typically, they find ways of having Vishnu's face present, even though it's an animal avatar. I found one absolutely delightful and possibly unique depiction of Matsya that takes the opposite approach. Here, it's an anthropomorphic body and a fish head. I should note that this is a subsidiary figure, one of 10 avatar images on the outside of a temple, so it wouldn't have necessarily been the object of a great deal of worship. But I think it's very successful. I kind of love the fish head, and I'm surprised that this approach wasn't adopted more often. This is at a very elaborately carved temple in Karnataka dating from the 13th century. The next avatar is a turtle or tortoise called Korma. Korma plays a foundational role in a very important episode, but he is probably the least active and is certainly the least charismatic of the avatars. The story begins when one of the gods, Indra, insults a great sage named Durvasa. Durvasa then curses all of the gods, not just Indra, but all of them. And as a group, they become quite weak. The demons are suddenly at an advantage over the gods, and they could possibly take over. So the gods approach Vishnu and they ask him to help. Vishnu tells the gods that they need to churn the ocean, like churning cream for butter. And they should do it using Mount Mandara as the paddle. They tie a giant snake named Vasuki around the mountain, and they enlist the demons to help, promising a share in whatever they achieve. In order for the mountain to spin, they need something for the mountain to stand on, a hard surface. So Vishnu assumes the form of a tortoise with a hard shell and dives to the bottom of the ocean, placing the mountain on his back. The gods and demons pull back and forth on the snake, and as the mountain spins, good things start to rise to the top of the ocean, just like butter rising from milk. The most important thing created in all of this is the Elixir of Immortality. But also created are the various items depicted at the top of this painting. The elephant that Indra will ride, a multi-headed horse, a wish-granting cow, and some particularly potent poison, among other things. We see little Korma at the bottom of this painting, at the base of the mountain. And just to remind us, and again, to give a human face to the avatar, Vishnu and his consort Lakshmi are depicted at the top of the mountain. Here's a painting that was used in the advertisement for this talk at the Carlos Museum. And again, we see the turtle at the bottom, the churning of the ocean. It doesn't look quite as taut as it did in the previous painting, and Vishnu at the top to remind us that he's the one that made it happen. And again, we can see that just as it was very appropriate to have Matsya dive down to the bottom of the ocean to retrieve the Vedas. So Vishnu took the form of a fish. Here, to have the hard-shelled turtle or tortoise, and I have to say they go back and forth in paintings, whether it looks more like a land tortoise or a sea turtle. To have that hard shell is absolutely crucial to serve as the sort of turning point for the churning of the ocean. And then again, in this painting, we have the various things that were churned up by this process of churning. Now, the demons had participated in the churning of the ocean because they were promised a share of the results. So everyone sat down to share the most important thing, which was the elixir of immortality. At this point, Vishnu assumes yet another form, that of a beautiful woman named Mohini. The demons, being less adept at reining in their desires, are immediately besotted by love and lust for Mohini, and distracted, they let down their guard. Vishnu / Mohini offers to serve the elixir to everyone, and she starts by serving it to the gods. When it's time to share the elixir with the demons, she simply disappears. In this way, the gods reassert their superiority over the demons. The gods become immortal and the demons are not. Now, in longer lists of avatars, Mohini often appears, and she is the only female form of Vishnu. You'll notice at the painting, there's a figure at the bottom who's been beheaded. This is a side story in which this is the only demon that managed to get a taste of the elixir of immortality. The gods don't want him to get too powerful, so they actually cut off his head, but he remains alive because he's had the elixir of immortality. He goes on to roam the heavens with his body and his head acting separately, where he causes all kind of trouble and is actually responsible for eclipses of the both lunar and solar. So the churning of the ocean, sometimes called the churning of the ocean of milk, is, as I said, a foundational account. It's told over and over again in Hindu scriptures, but it's not as popular a subject in Indian art as one might guess. It does show up in places where a long horizontal subject is appropriate, as in this narrow band of relief carving on the base of a temple. Korma is usually present, but he's hardly a major component of the composition and is usually just barely discernible as a turtle. We see him right here. But it's true that his role was, frankly, to stand still while everyone around him worked hard on the churning. As one might expect, there is relatively little focused worship of Korma. He's usually honored as one in the group of avatars. This temple in Andhra Pradesh is perhaps the only major standalone temple dedicated to the avatar. I have never been there, I've only read about it, but I understand that the icon enshrined in this temple in Andhra Pradesh is in the shape of a tortoise. And I'm showing it to you here on the right. Even apparently when it's not covered in flowers, it's still impossible to really get a sense of what it looks like because it's been so entirely covered with offerings of colored powder and paste and sandalwood. Now this turtle icon is said to be what they call Svayambhu. Svayambhu means self-formed, which means that it was not created by the hands of man. Typically, these Svayambhu images have been found somewhere in the bottom of a tank or in a cave, and they're believed to have been brought down from heaven and to be far more powerful than a man-made icon. And it's likely that the finding of this miraculously made turtle icon was the reason for the foundation for this temple, but I haven't actually tracked that down. Usually icons of Korma look sort of like icons of Matsya. showing the upper half of an anthropomorphic Vishnu emerging from the head of a tortoise or turtle, as seen on this image on a pillar in Hampi, otherwise known as Vijayanagar, a major site in Karnataka that I'll actually be coming back to. And then you also see both Korma and Matsya, Korma on the left and Matsya on the right, in this folk painting from Bihar. And at the center is, I guess that's Vishnu, although frankly it looks, yes, it is Vishnu. And here it's an imaginative, a new imagining of what it would look like when he was lying on the serpent Ananta. Now, while the Korma story is not found as often as one might expect in Indian art, it was extremely popular, at least for a brief time, in the art of the Khmer Empire, particularly at the Khmer capital of Angkor in modern-day Cambodia. The churning of the ocean is said to have been very important to Khmer rulers, and it was reenacted in giant pageants at court. There are many different representations of the subject, with two particularly prominent examples. The first is this extremely long and detailed relief carving at Angkor Wat, which shows hundreds of figures engaged in the pulling, with thousands of heavenly figures above and lots of delightful sea creatures below. I think you can start to make out some of the fish and the sort of crocodilian characters down below. At the center is Korma, who is really not all that well-defined there, with a little bit of a mountain on top of him, and a large figure of dancing Vishnu, who is really the focus for the image. Now, there's no good way to photograph this relief in its entirety. It goes on for hundreds of feet, all the way down a very long, basically hallway at Angkor Wat. But these shots give you a sense of what it's like to experience it in person, with the repetition of pulling figures and the giant multiple cobra hoods of the snake at one end. And then there's this incredibly dramatic depiction of the same episode in over life-size sculptures carved in the round, placed on either side of the bridge that serves as the entrance to the palace and temple complex at Angkor Thom. One side of the bridge is the gods wearing conical crowns, and the other is the demons with more ferocious faces. Everyone is kneeling, bracing themselves for the pull, and the body of the snake serves as the railing for the bridge. The giant multi-hooded snake at one end is particularly dramatic, and as if you haven't noticed already, that divine snakes have multiple heads and multiple cobra hoods, creating this kind of canopy effect. There are actually several of these churning groups at Angkor Thom and at other sites. The fact that everyone is facing the same direction on opposite sides of the street initially doesn't make sense, but there were identical lineups of gods and demons at the other entrances to the complex, which are axially on the other, just, across from it. So we can imagine the complex as the mountain, and these figures are pulling from all directions back and forth, churning the central complex as the mountain. It's interesting that the ruler who built these gateways was actually Buddhist, but by this time the churning appears to have taken on a more sort of dynastic or royal quality rather than being strictly a celebration of Vishnu. The subject appears all over Cambodia and elsewhere in Southeast Asia, where it's particularly popular as the subject for door lintels, probably because it's such an inherently horizontal subject. Again, Korma is pretty small and a quiet presence, and the major role is played by Vishnu, reiterated by placing a very dynamic figure of the god at the center above the tortoise. Now we move on to Varaha, the boar avatar of Vishnu, and as Ellen mentioned, my personal favorite. Wild boars are not typically among the animals that American school kids learn about. But in India, they have a strong reputation for fierceness, strength, and almost foolhardy bravery. It's said that a wild boar will stand up and hold his ground against a tiger. Wild boars are also great diggers, capable of destroying a field of crops, and they have a fine sense of smell, which is why French people use them to find truffles. All of these features combine to explain why Vishnu assumed the form of a wild boar. The story of Varaha takes place not long after creation, when Manu, the ancestor of man, lives on what little bit of dry land there is, surrounded by the primordial ocean. We know from the Matsya story that the ocean was always a threat in these early days. In this story, the land is once again consumed by the sea and sinks to the bottom. So Manu calls on Vishnu to save the earth. Vishnu appears as Varaha the boar, burrows into the water, sniffs out the earth, and lifts it up, placing it back on the surface. In this painting, we see Varaha with the blue color and 4 attributes of Vishnu, lifting a hill with a little building on it and trees, and that little hill and building and trees represent the earth. He's trampling on the prostrate form of a demon. The demon is Hiranyaksha, and in some tellings of the story, Hiranyaksha is responsible for pulling the earth into the water. His motives for submerging the earth are not entirely clear. It could be that he simply wants to create chaos. Varaha quickly dispatches of Hiranyaksha using Vishnu's mace. Here we can see that the battle takes place in a wonderfully abstracted, watery setting with lotus plants. And the earth, again depicted here as a little hill with a castle, is now also populated by a cow and a peacock. Here on the right, I'm showing the Carlos Museum's painting of the subject. The painting is cataloged as being around the same time or earlier than the one on the left. I actually think it's a little later. But in either case, it's fun to compare the artist's solution for depicting the watery setting, which was always a challenge for these artists, and for depicting the earth. This is as good a point as any to point out that we have shifted from an anthropomorphic Vishnu emerging from the body of a fish or tortoise to an anthropomorphic Vishnu with the head of a boar. Now, most often, especially in sculptures, the earth is also represented in anthropomorphic form. The earth is represented as a goddess, the earth mother Bhudevi. In this bronze sculpture from Kerala in southern India, the boar avatar raises the little goddess on his shoulder. She holds her hands together in a gesture of worship and gratitude, thanking him for saving her. You'll notice that he has one foot slightly raised, and that was actually the case in one of the paintings as well, telling us that he has just stepped up and out of the ocean. In some Hindu texts, the boar avatar and the goddess actually fall in love, and they recite romantic poetry to each other. Bhudevi is also listed as one of Vishnu's consorts. So it's all related. Makes sense that she would be attracted to Vishnu in boar form as well. In this stone sculpture from northern India, Bhudevi appears on Varaha's shoulder again, but now she's reaching out to pat him on the nose, a lovely, affectionate detail. Here, he's really stepping up and out of the ocean with one foot elevated and resting on a lotus flower that is held by female snake deities or nagas who traditionally live in the ocean. So they represent the water that he's coming up out of. Often Indian gods in various religions are depicted with parasols over their heads. This is a gesture of respect, just as one would hold a parasol over the king to shield him from the hot sun. But here, the parasol is a giant lotus leaf, another charming detail designed to remind us that we are in an aquatic setting. And actually there is a Varaha image at the Carlos that has a similar treatment with a lotus leaf serving as the parasol for the avatar. So let's look at some Varaha images in situ in India. Here's a very early representation of the same scene carved into a cliff face at a site in central India called Udayagiri. It's the earliest representation we'll see today of Varaha, and it's a reminder that Varaha was perhaps the first of the avatars to really rise to prominence, at least the first, certainly the first of the animal avatars. A variation of the Varaha account appears in texts from the Vedic period, roughly 3,000 years ago. In this early image, the iconography has already been pretty firmly established. The goddess is kind of dangling from his snout as he steps up. Again, we have Nagas to remind us that we're in a watery setting. In this case, it's a Naga king, one of these snake deities. And he's paying homage from below, while from above, this sort of heavenly host of thousands of gods and sages and ancestors of men assemble to watch the dramatic rescue. I should point out Varaha's heroic physique. For hundreds of years, earthly kings compared themselves to the boar as a great heroic and strong muscular type, a savior of their own people. Here's another charming image of Varaha having saved Bhudevi, located in the fascinating 7th century site of Mamallapuram, south of Chennai in Tamil Nadu in Southeast India. This is another giant relief carved into living rock, but now an entire interior has been carved out with pillars and a facade that mimic architecture. This large scene covers one of the side walls of the cave, and the figures are mostly much larger than life size. In this scene, Bhudevi sits on Varaha's knee, again, lifted up to show that he's stepping out of the water. And again, there's a Naga worshiping from below. And the worshiping figures on the left are probably Manu and a god, possibly Brahma. And the figure standing at the right may be Hiranyaksha, because he's not making a gesture of reverence toward Varaha. It's hard to know because demons aren't always depicted looking demonic. One of the most celebrated but least visited images of Varaha is in the small remote town of Iran, also in central India. Iran used to be a major trading post in the Gupta period and is now, as I said, a very small town. This 11-foot tall, 13-foot long image is, as you can see, fully in the form of a boar. The fancy word for this is teriomorphic, meaning in the shape of an animal, as opposed to anthropomorphic in the shape of a human. You can see a similarly massive image of standing Vishnu in the background. Not only does this Varaha have a charming image of Bhudevi hanging from his snout, but he's covered with more than 1,000 little images of gods and sages. He wears a necklace with 28 round plaques depicting 28 astronomical gods. That's the necklace. On his slightly protruding tongue, there is even a tiny image of a goddess who might be Sarasvati, the goddess of music and learning. On the base below him, there are sea creatures, more nagas and other sea animals. Now, fully boar-shaped Varaha images always seem to have been objects of worship. They tend to be set up on an altar where they would have received prayer and offerings, as opposed to being on the side of a temple, sort of serving as more of an illustration. The platform at Iran shows hints to the fact that there was once a whole temple surrounding this sculpture. To get a sense of what the Iran temple might have looked like, here's a Varaha temple at Khajuraho on the other side of Madhya Pradesh, built about 400 years later. Like the Iran boar, Khajuraho's is teriomorphic and is covered with a cast of thousands, but he doesn't have the same charming earth goddess hanging from his snout, and he's both smaller and less carefully carved than the earlier prototype. He's in a very unusual temple. It's open to the air on all sides with a somewhat lower tower than usual. This kind of structure is usually created for Shiva temples, where large images of Shiva's bull Nandi sit in this temple facing through the front door of the Shiva temple so that Nandi can face his master. This particular Varaha temple is in the vicinity of a larger Vishnu temple, but it's not on the central axis the way a Nandi temple would be. That spot is taken in this complex by a temple to Lakshmi, Vishnu's consort. Here are two more Varaha temples. The one on the left is in Rajasthan in northern India, and the one on the right is at Mysore in southern India. Although Varaha remains a popular deity, there really aren't too many temples dedicated specifically to him. In fact, he appears to have been more popular in an ancient period than he is today. More often, he appears in subsidiary shrines in larger Vishnu temple complexes, and he is a frequent inclusion in as a very small image in images of Vishnu, sort of one of the surrounding figures. All right, the last of the animal avatars is actually only half animal. This is Nara Simha, whose name translates literally as man lion or man tiger. He's depicted here looking a little bit like a horse in what's known as a Kaligat painting, made in large numbers for sale outside the Kali temple in Kolkata in the 19th century. With this avatar, we start transitioning, not just to human-looking avatars, but to a more familiar realm. We leave the primordial ocean behind, and we enter a world that is more fully populated, with adversaries who are smarter, with clearer motivations and more interesting foibles. It's my sense, and I'm sure I'm not alone, that the animal avatars were appropriate to their time, when there weren't a lot of humans and the job at hand was largely physical, requiring specific physical talents. With Narasimha, we enter a realm of nuances, strategies, and outthinking the enemy instead of just sort of brute power. So it's interesting that into this realm comes what is actually Vishnu's most violent and most fearsome avatar. Vishnu descends as Narasimha to rid the world of the demon Yakashipu. That's a mouthful, I know. He is actually the brother of Varaha's nemesis, Hiranyaksha. Yakashipu is a far more sophisticated foe. Like so many demons that Vishnu will face in future avatars, this demon has amassed enormous powers, and he did so at least initially with the help from a god. After the death of his brother, Yakashipu enters a long period of devout asceticism. He performs penances and he meditates, and for all intents and purposes, he behaves like a very devout individual. The god Brahma rewards this apparently righteous behavior by offering to grant him a wish. The demon asks that he be invincible by any creature created by Brahma the creator, unslayable by any weapon, day or night, on earth or in the sky, indoors or out. Brahma grants this wish, and with this wish granted, the demon goes on to take over the world. He has a son, however. It's the classic sort of powerful man, disappointing son story. His son, Prahlada, becomes by a twist of fate an avid devotee of Vishnu. One evening at dusk, the father mocks his fate, his son's faith. The father mocks his son's faith and says, "You say your God is everywhere. Would you say he's in the pillars of this palace? Because I certainly don't see him there." He then proceeds to kick one of the pillars, showing his lack of respect for the notion that Vishnu might possibly be in there. And suddenly, from that very pillar emerges Nara Simha, Vishnu in the form of a half man, half lion. He pops out of the pillar and he proceeds to disembowel the evil demon. So this episode is illustrated at the base of this image of Nara Simha, wonderful image from Eastern India or Bangladesh. Here we see Yakashipu kicking the pillar. There's the pillar. This is probably Prahalada, his son, in a gesture of reverence. And here is Narasimha popping out of the pillar. Now, everything about the killing of Yakashipu is designed to work around Brahma's wish granting. It is essentially a story about legal loopholes. Vishnu was not created by Brahma. If anything, he created Brahma. So, he falls outside of the category of any creature created by Brahma. Narasimha is neither man nor beast, nor even precisely a god. He's an avatar, a sort of neither here nor there state of being. Again, not covered by the boon. He appears at dusk. It's neither day nor night. Narasimha lifts the demon onto his lap. So the demon is neither on the land nor in the air when he's killed. Narasimha uses his claws, not a proper weapon. And in some tellings of the story, he kills the demon on a doorstep, neither inside nor out. Although most often he's shown sitting on the split pillar from which he emerged, which is again also not really in or out. Here we see Prahlada worshiping the avatar, even as the avatar eviscerates his father, because Prahlada knows that this is the right thing to do. The demon's crown tellingly falls to the floor. And over here is the demon's empty throne. So his reign of terror is over and balance will be returned to the earth. There will no longer be this excessively powerful individual. Here are two historic images of Narasimha that remain in situ. The one on the left is from the wonderfully intricate temples of the Hoysala dynasty, which ruled the Karnataka area in the 12th and 13th century. Here you can see that the sculptor has Narasimha pulling the entrails out of his victim and coiling them into a decorative garland that then frames his head. You can see his two hands up here. He's got many, many arms in this image. And here are the entrails creating this sort of necklace around him. You'll note that the demon doesn't look terribly upset. And it's, as an aside, it's actually rather typical that these demons are in many ways blessed by being killed by these gods. It's a real blessing to be in such extended presence and to have the divine's attention so fully during being killed by one of them. And it's usually said that they go on to better incarnations in the next life. That's actually not the case with Yakashipu, but that's because he had been cursed earlier. The relief at the right is from a much older temple, also in Karnataka, from a group of man-made caves at Badami, dating to the 6th century. This is a very large image, about 6 feet high, and it's unusual because it doesn't show Narasimha killing his victim. It shows him later, following his victory, just sort of swaggering a bit and enjoying his achievement. This kind of subject of the victorious god, not at the moment of defeating the enemy, but sort of afterward and celebrating, it wouldn't be repeated much in later temples of images of Narasimha. You find it more often, actually quite a lot, in images of Durga, the goddess, after her defeat of the buffalo demon. Another story. And I would argue that when he's not in the act of killing his victim, that Narasimha can actually have a sort of sweet aspect to him. Now, in interesting contrast to the violent and victorious images of Narasimha we've seen so far, there is another tradition of representing the avatar in yogic meditation. I'm showing you a giant stone image from Hampi, otherwise known as Vijayanagar, also in Karnataka. This image, I think including the sort of canopy over it, is 21 feet high. I'm also showing you, also from southern India, but this time on the Tamil Nadu side, is a Chola bronze from somewhat earlier, about 300 years earlier, that is about 1/10 the size of the stone image. When we see Narasimha in meditation like this, it's a form called Yoga Narasimha, and it shows the god seated cross-legged, sometimes using a band to support his knees, as we see in both of these. That's something that is still sometimes used to help facilitate meditation. You typically don't see the other avatars meditating. The Hindu god most famous for meditating is Shiva. Shiva engages in yogic practice for eons. He meditates and he builds up an enormous reservoir of heat and power. It's sort of like using meditation to recharge your batteries. But then he is capable of frenzied fighting and dancing that is unmatched by any other god. So it makes sense that Narasimha, who is the most aggressive and furious of the avatars, would also be the one who meditates. Like Shiva, his yogic practice is both a foil for his fury and the source of his power. Narasimha today is often worshipped together with his consort or wife, who is usually just referred to as Lakshmi, which is another name for one of Vishnu's consorts. The old religious texts do not refer to her much, and there's no great story to connect Narasimha with Lakshmi, but Lakshmi is the goddess of good fortune and plenty. So her gentle generosity balances out Narasimha's unforgiving ferocity rather nicely. This is an image from Nepal, and here we see the two sharing a ride on Vishnu's man-eagle Garuda. The sculpture has some nice details. The couple are surrounded by a flaming halo. You could see the flames swirling around them, while below them are swirling clouds here, and angular forms, which are rocks. This is all rock forms. It looks a little bit like a brain, but those are all supposed to be rocks. And then below Garuda are lines representing cascading water. It's a very Nepalese scene. Picture we're up in the mountains with waterfalls emerging from rocky heights, and the rocky heights practically touch the clouds. It also suggests that Narasimha is lord of land, water, air, and fire. Narasimha temples were historically less common than Varaha temples, but today I think they outnumber those dedicated to Varaha. Both gods were cited by kings and other military types as heroic role models, although not to the same extent as the later human form avatars, most notably Rama. There have been many kings named Narasimha. There do seem to be more Narasimha temples in the south of India. I'm showing you two historic temples here on the left. One in Karnataka above, a much older temple, and then a very dramatically situated temple in Vellore in Tamil Nadu below. Then there was also a taste for the more ferocious or tantric deities in the foothills of the Himalayas in Himachal Pradesh and into Nepal. So I'm also then showing you here on the right a temple in Barmore near Chamba. Narasimha today is Narasimha is worshipped widely today, especially on Narasimha Jayanti or Narasimha Chaturthi, the day celebrated as the Avatar's birthday, which lands around May, depending on how the lunar calendar lines up with the 365-day calendar. But Narasimha worship is considered by many to be a dangerous undertaking. ISKCON, known in the West as the Hare Krishnas, states flat out that people should not keep Narasimha images in their home shrines. Others advise that it's okay to install a Narasimha image in your home shrine, but only if it's initiated by a priest with extensive knowledge of tantric practices. Who can then also give guidance in how to carry on puja, which is worship, in the proper manner as well. All these precautions are because Narasimha, like many other fierce deities, such as the goddess Kali or the Bhairava form of Shiva, Narasimha is easily angered. One's good intentions, if carried out improperly, can backfire and cause great suffering and bad fortune. In this, Narasimha actually differs quite dramatically from the other avatars, who are generally understood to be placid, even-headed, and compassionate. So this brings us to the end of the animal avatars, and thus to the end of the scope of my talk. The next avatar is human in form, a Brahmin priest of short stature named Vamana. His size is key to his victory over the greedy king Bali, just as the animal attributes of the previous 4 avatars were key to their victories. So we'll end with this beautiful image of Vishnu from the Carlos Museum that Cynthia Packard treated so well in her previous talk. I will remind you that 2 of the avatars we looked at today appear in the top corners of this image. Now you know how to pick out Varaha and Narasimha because you know that they're so often represented in this way, and it'll be easier for you to pick them out, even when they're small and in a crowded composition. So here is Varaha with his boar snout. And here is Narasimha with his lion head, eviscerating the tiny demon. The basic message delivered in any image of a god or goddess, when we see them with multiple arms, and this one is really multiple arms, it's unusually multiple, is the message that we get when we see a god with multiple arms is that they act in numerous ways, and they can do so simultaneously. Each weapon held by the god represents a different strength. So I'll return to my analogy that I brought up at the very beginning, that avatars are like the god reaching one hand down to take care of things on earth. The avatars are a little bit like weapons, although they're far more nuanced and charismatic. The message behind the avatars of Vishnu is much the same as that of the multiple arms on a Vishnu image. The avatars, like Vishnu, are many things, and all of them are beneficial. So with that, I will take any questions you may have, and I thank you for sticking it out. That was a lot of information in one talk. Yeah, let's do some questions.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, you went over a lot of really rich images, and there are a bunch of questions in the Q&A that I've been looking at. I'll just go through chronologically as they came in. So Jakey Fine asks about these different versions of Matsya, and they ask, why are some images of the demon in the shell the Shankasura? Why are some Hayagriva with the horse head? And then why, okay, I should depiction horse head. And then there are some with Manu, saving Manu. Are these Matsyas, plural? Are they one or many? Are they part of the same yuga? Should we understand this Matsya as same thing or different things?
Both stories about Matsya appear in the Bhagavata Purana, which is treated by many as sort of the definitive text about Vishnu. They are not conflated in that text the way they sort of are in that one painting. I think that was an artist really taking some liberties. The idea of depicting the demon Hayagriva with a horse head, I think is a bit of a misunderstanding, because there is a deity with a horse head named Hayagriva. But by no means should we understand that deity with the horse head as being the enemy of Matsya. I think it's just that there happened to be a demon with the same name as the deity with the horse head. So I think that's a misunderstanding by the artist, perhaps. Yeah, I think that's, yeah, I can see why it would be confusing and why he would want to conflate them. But yeah, I mean, we get, you know, as I think we all know, there are different versions of these stories, depending on which text you look in, and depending sometimes even what chapter of that text you look in. You can get two different versions of the same story in the same text. And you know, they're all valid because they're in the scripture. And it's really just up to the artists, or to the people that commission the paintings, or to the Brahmins that were consulting with the artists, to determine how and which and what details to bring into the painting.
Okay, that segues really nicely into the next question by another one of my students, Anya. So she asked, how do you choose which version of stories to tell to a broad audience when different texts tell stories differently, and maybe we don't want to privilege. So she asked when Korma was going on, and perhaps, I don't want to speak for her, but in class we discussed whether or not we should even call this an avatar of Vishnu, because in the Mahabharata it doesn't say it's Vishnu, and Korma doesn't necessarily have to be Vishnu when he facilitates the churning of the ocean. So anyway, how do you choose which version of stories to privilege?
Well, I mean, this is going to be a problem anytime you talk about anything in Hinduism. One of the things I always warn students and young scholars and all of that is that almost anything you say about the various accounts in Hinduism, there will be another account that contradicts it. And yet they're all valid. So it's especially hard giving a talk like this, because I'm trying to simplify things a little. I'm trying to digest it and pull it together for an audience, and not say, well, there's also a version where it does this, and then there's a version where this. But there's really no winning here, because there are so many different takes on these essential truths. And in the end, the details aren't as important as the overall message, or at least that's what I would argue. But this is where major theological battles have been fought, is over which account to privilege over others. And far be it from me to say that the stories that I've told you are the definitive stories. You know, it could just as easily be told in different ways.
Yeah, I guess we have to privilege our pieces, our paintings, our sculptures.
Right. I mean, yeah. So I go with what we have in the paintings or sculptures.
Okay, so there are a lot of questions about Korma and Cambodia. So why did Korma, an anonymous person asked, why did Korma appeal to Khmer rulers?
I don't think it was Korma. I think it was the battle between good and evil. I think they really saw it, even though really it's at that moment, it's the gods and the demons collaborating. I do think that they saw it as a sort of push-pull, and this is just me speculating, but the truth is there's very little written from the period of the Khmer Empire that says, we like it for this reason. It's one of those things that historians are constantly running into. Wouldn't it be great if somebody would just explain why? I have a colleague who worked for a long time on the why. But I do think that there was something very appealing there about this push-pull between good and evil on opposite sides, both of them vying for supremacy. And then the knowledge that good wins out.
Yeah. There's another question about, so this is related. I think this is probably, you'll have the same answer for this. Why depict this at Buddhist temples? I guess I have a related question. Is the deity atop the mountain or atop the churning stick? Is that Vishnu?
I take it as Vishnu. I take it as Vishnu. Well, at Angkor, it's not really an issue to take it as Vishnu.
But I was looking, I did see it. Seemed
at
like
Angkor Wat. Yeah. He's not necessarily carrying all the stuff that we associate with Vishnu, but it certainly seems to be Vishnu. I could be wrong. People should go ahead and disagree with me, but and then, okay, so then why did the Buddhists, I think by the time Angkor Thom was created, that this churning of the ocean was so integral to this sort of kingship story, or the kingship brand of the of Khmer Empire, that it was perfectly acceptable to include it in the Angkor Thom layout. And I should also point out that the main temple that we think of as being Buddhist, the one that the same ruler created, the Bayon, actually has quite a bit of Hindu imagery in it, and shrines to Hindu deities in what we kind of think of as a Buddhist temple.
Right, yeah, so we shouldn't necessarily immediately think Buddhism.
Right.
Look at that side.
Right, yeah, I mean, there's much blurrier lines between the two traditions.
Yeah, variety of deities that had risen into prominence at that time and then were put together in a systematic way. Yeah. Okay, on the same question, the person asked, is this syncretism at Angkor Wat related to the integration of the Buddha as an avatar of Vishnu?
No, I think that is a very specifically Indian Hindu thing. And that's, the integration of the Buddha as an avatar, I mean, this is a perfectly good time to bring it up, is when you read the texts, it's not, it doesn't really read as an attempt to bring Buddhists into the fold. I always used to assume that the Buddha avatar was an attempt to win over Buddhists to Vaishnavism. And in fact, when you read the accounts of the Buddha avatar, it's really about fooling people into following a fake religion. So the Buddha avatar is designed to lead people astray, usually lower caste people who were inappropriately studying texts that weren't something that lower caste people were supposed to study. And so the Buddha presented them with an alternative religion so that they would kind of leave the Vedas alone. And yeah, it's not a flattering story.
Right.
It's not pro-Buddhist.
Right. Yeah, I think that's important to note. Okay, there are two questions on Nara Simha and why he sometimes looks like a tiger, sometimes looks like a lion, sometimes looks like a horse. So one of my students, Shreyas, asks, is there a cultural or religious significance to
well, I mean, Simha is, it's a Sanskritic word that has been used alternately for either lion or tiger. You see it for both. And it's, I think, a matter of regional traditions in many cases. Most people in India are more familiar with tigers. They have a broader range in India. But lions held a certain mystique as well. So I think it has, like so many things, it has a lot to do with, how your grandma always described it to you, or, what your local priest says it is. And there's no real rule about which one he is. Now, the horse thing, that's just a funny quirk of representation in that one painting. Those are relatively naive, sort of self-taught kind of paintings. And I think, nobody would ever describe him as being a horse. I think it's just a coincidence that he happens to kind of look horsey in that painting.
Right, yeah. I think in our painting, Narasimha looks very much like a tiger. In the ones we've been looking at, it makes sense that these painters are more familiar with tigers because we've been seeing a lot of tigers. Okay, Tejas Dave asks, can you elaborate a bit on the structural break between Varaha and Narasimha, coupled with the strong link between their respective demons? Yeah, so their demons are brothers.
Yeah, I mean, yes, the demons are brothers, but it's so interesting how different the stories are. We really get a big sense of like the origin story for Narasimha's victim. And we get very little. The two are brothers. There's a backstory in which both of them actually had been on Vishnu's side. They served as his guards, and a sage comes along, a very powerful sage, and they won't let him in to see Vishnu because Vishnu has said, don't let me be disturbed. And so the sage curses the two of them to be reborn 3 times as demons. So they then appear again in the Ramayana and in the Krishna story, again as brothers who are demons. But it just strikes me that there's very little backstory in the Varaha story for what the motivations are behind Hiranyaksha. And the Varaha story really feels situated in that primordial moment when the ocean is a major force. And then the ocean has nothing to do with the Narasimha story. So I don't know how to account for the break. But I really do see the Narasimha story as being this transitional story between the age of the animals and the age of men. And suddenly it's taking place on land.
Yeah, that is very interesting because they're connected in this way. Their demons are both brothers. They're graphically often connected, like in our sculpture that I'm looking at right now, again and again and again, they're seen together. Yet they also serve as this moment, this break, but from one type of avatar to another type of avatar. Okay, that's really interesting. Okay, Roshni asked a question I'm very interested in for our exhibit. Yes, it was fascinating talk, thank you. Curious about how you describe the birth of an avatar. We were debating this. Do we say that they descend because descending suggests they come from somewhere else, but Vishnu is everywhere? Which avatar would you describe as born or gestated rather than manifested? Do these moments receive a lot of attention from artists? Oh, that's another good question too, like the birth of an avatar.
Yeah. Well, okay. Rama
I just threw a lot out at you. So, okay,
yeah, Rama and Krishna are definitely born. They have infancies. I can't remember ever reading anything about Parashurama having an infancy, nor can I remember anything about Vamana having an infancy. But yeah, I mean, the stories get more and more complex as you go along. Whereas the animal avatars really do seem to just manifest.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Well, and especially Narasimha, who pops out of the pillar.
Right. Yeah, I think I'm taking a note of that. Yeah. So the animal ones really manifest, whereas the humans, we do have their life stories, more or less. Okay.
Yeah, and then, what happens, Krishna dies. So, I mean, what happens to Varaha and Narasimha after their job is done? They essentially resume their position as sort of gods. They don't wander the earth. I don't know. It's very complicated, but there's no rule for what an avatar biography has to be. They're all different.
Yeah, I think that's something we'll have to note in our exhibit for sure. It's not just that there's God up in the heaven and then he descends and then he goes back. It's much more complicated.
Yeah, yeah, and in keeping with the idea that he's everywhere, and can do multiple things at once, is the idea that, you know, you can be down there being Krishna, having a life, dying, and then yet Krishna continues to be and was before that.
Yeah. Okay. This question I like a lot too, from another student, Matthew. In Vishnu sleeping on the cosmic ocean, maybe we can go back to that first image. Is Vishnu's female companion definitely Lakshmi? So you discussed this as well in, I think 2 images ago, that it was labeled and consort, or 3. Yeah, right. Anyway, is it definitely Lakshmi? Could it possibly be Bhudevi?
Yes, it could be Bhudevi.
And should we label it as such, as Bhudevi, or should we just say consort? I think in your catalog you label it just as consort. Okay.
I would, yeah. I mean, okay, there are texts who specifically name her as Lakshmi. I think there probably are other texts that specifically name her as Bhudevi. And I think there are some texts that just call her Shri. There are also texts that posit that he was alone. And then, of course, one of the things, I didn't really mention this in my lecture because it complicates things considerably, is that one of the things that comes out of the churning of the ocean is supposed to be Lakshmi. So is that to say, and then yet she appears there in images of the churning of the ocean, and you know, she's a goddess, she's eternal. She presumably existed before that, depending on whom you ask. So again, there are these apparent narrative conflicts, but in the end, they're okay. They can kind of all be true.
Yeah, I like thinking of her as Bhudevi, the earth. If we think about the layers of existence in our sculpture, in this painting, we have sort of the ocean, and then we have kind of the earth and the heavens. But maybe it's not that simple at all. So maybe we just label it as and consort. Okay, David Millins asks, oh yeah, back to births of avatars. So the celebration of Narasimha's birthday is celebrating what exactly then? If he just kind of appears.
I honestly don't know that much about that holiday. It may be an oversimplification to call it his birthday. You know, there are birthdays celebrated for any number of deities who frankly are considered eternal. So what does it mean to call it a birthday? I think it's in many ways it would be, yeah, it's complicated. I don't think that it really marks precisely a day of being born. Because if you then were to ask somebody who really worships Narasimha, they would say, no, Narasimha is eternal, has always been and always will be.
Yeah. Vasudha Narayana says Narasimha Jayanti marks the manifestation. Yeah. Manifestation of Narasimha, not birth. That makes sense. Coming back to this language that we use in our exhibit, especially, I think we have to be cognizant of these terms that we use. I guess I'll ask one more question. We're running out of time. There are some, one question by Antoinette says, is mohini sometimes depicted naked and with snakes? She was at Belur last year and came across a sculpture that I thought might be mohini. If we want to go back to that image of mohini.
Yeah, I don't recall her having snakes. Please, somebody in the audience, if you know the answer to that,
Maybe I shouldn't have ended on this question. Yeah, I have no idea.
Yeah, I have no idea. I do not associate her with snakes. There are plenty of other goddesses who are associated with snakes, but
So maybe this was another goddess this person saw.
I don't know. I mean, there's Manasa, who's a snake goddess.
Yeah, that's what it is.
I don't know.
Okay,
Sorry.
that
idea.
that was kind of a sad way to end. But thank you so much for this talk. It was really rich, and I learned so much. And I guess we'll see you in our class on Thursday. The students are really looking forward to it. So thanks again.
Well, thank you. It was my pleasure. And yeah, and I encourage people to go out and delve more deeply into these because, as I said, all of these stories have alternate versions and other takes and other ways of being explained. So yeah, mine is not the only answer. Yeah, but thank you.
Oh, Elizabeth, I think you're muted.
Thank you, Joan. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you all for coming. It's been a wonderful, wonderful evening, and I can't wait till class on Thursday. Bye-bye.